Okay.
Is it live? No.
Mm-hmm.
Give me the thing to share. Why can't I share it? Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon and welcome. Today we're going to talk a bit about the war on the frontier, or the revolution on the frontier. My name is Sam McGinty. I'm an interpreter here at the Frontier Culture Museum. So first we should talk a little bit more broadly about the Revolutionary War. Fought between 1775 and 1783. It spanned the entire North American continent, or at least east of the Mississippi, and comprised a variety of powers. Obviously the 13 colonies, or 13 states, fought on one side against the British Empire on another side. Later on in the war, certainly the colonies, or later states, were helped by a number of allies, the French and the Spanish included, which allowed us to actually win the war. Now, speaking more specifically about the war on the frontier, we sort of should talk about the frontier we're talking about. Here at the Frontier Culture Museum, we often focus on the Valley of Virginia, roughly speaking the area between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Alleghenies. This was an area that had been settled as early as the 1720s, and by the 1760s and 70s was really filled with a variety of very distinct frontier individuals. The Valley of Virginia was a tremendous contributor to the Revolutionary War effort, largely because they had a variety of men who were competent, skilled backwoodsmen, relatively skilled with firearms, and had a good knowledge and proficiency of those that were capable of going off and fighting. So to quote Philip Vickers-Fithian, who was a preacher here in 1775, he said something along the lines of, "Mars, the great god of battle, is honored in every part of this spacious colony, but here, particularly in the valley, all the war beats and sounds are martial, and the men are much like the hardy, resolute, and invincible natives of the woods of America." So, talking about this area, these men would go and fight throughout the North American continent, as far north as Canada, in Montreal and Quebec, and far south into the Carolinas. They would contribute manpower in just about every major battle of the Revolutionary War, and certainly significant commanding officers and leaders as well. Men like Daniel Morgan, Peter Muhlenberg, Charles Porterfield were all officers that were competent frontiersmen that went off to help to lead and fight the Revolutionary War. Speaking more broadly about the war on the frontier, part of the Revolutionary War that most people don't really think about or consider is the fact that we had a separate war really going on between Virginia and Pennsylvania and a variety of Ohio Indian tribes that were allied to the British Empire. So those groups were warring pretty constantly along the frontier, along the Ohio River, and Virginia was really responsible for protecting most of its sister states on that frontier line. Most of the frontier troops were commanded by a man by the name of George Rogers Clark, who was the overall commander. He captured a number of towns further to the west in what's now Illinois, towns like Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes, effectively expanding the fledgling United States all the way west to the Mississippi. Today, we're going to focus on another particular unit led by a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Crockett. This was called Crockett's Western Battalion, and that's the uniform that I'm wearing, and you'll see some of my colleagues wearing here in a bit. This was a frontier unit raised in this area to defend the frontier and more broadly defend Virginia as a whole. For the most part, they were actually active not in this area of Virginia, but further west along the Ohio River, around what was modern-day Louisville. But they were very proficient frontier warriors. They understood a variety of tactics that had been adapted and had been learned throughout a variety of wars with Eastern Woodland Indian tribes and through the French and Indian War. So you'll see today how they would react to contact or if they were attacked on the march, and that's what we'll be showing you. So here we have a column on the march. They are going by what is called Indian files in the period, basically a single line. They've now expanded west once they've seen contact or seen an opponent. They are now in an open line. They're using rocks, trees, and cover to their advantage as best as they can. Especially here on the frontier, the woods of North America are going to provide really advantageous cover for troops. They don't need to be quite so exposed. The weapons that these men are using are largely rifles and muskets. These are single-shot weapons, so after each shot they need to reload. These men are firing in pairs. What that means is that one man will fire, then the next man will protect him as he reloads. So they should fire, and then another will fire, so on and so forth. A proficient soldier using a musket can be able to load and fire it about once every 15 seconds or 4 times a minute. For rifles, which is what most of these troops were carrying, that could take a bit longer. It might be 1 or 2 shots a minute maximum. While the rifles that these men have provide a great range, moving and running on an 18th century battlefield was tremendously important. So the men will advance, reload, and fire again. Again, each man waits until his partner has reloaded before he fires. Particularly when speaking about Crockett's Western Battalion, we're looking at men that are proficient with these firearms, what you could almost consider to be marksmen. So they are taking their time, aiming and picking their targets, and should be accurate about 200 to 300 yards in range, so several fields. One of the most advantageous covers in North America is a fence. So they are advancing to this fence line, using it for cover, also using it to prop the barrels of their guns, allowing them a bit more accuracy. The Western Battalion, in fact, was a composite of multiple types of troops. You see the regulars in their brown coats, similar to what I am wearing. You also see men of George Slaughter's Corps of Indian Fighters wearing hunting shirts and Indian garb, leggings, moccasins, and breechclouts, and also members of the militia, which you see Mark in his bright blue coat. So he's just wearing the clothes he brought from home, whereas the other troops are wearing proper military uniforms. Particularly on the frontier, supply and proper outfitting and equipping troops was often quite an issue. The Western Battalion was fortunate in that they got proper cloth and clothing from the state storehouse in Richmond, which was called the Public Store. But for others, like the militia, they really just need to bring whatever they had at home.
Cease fire, climb and load. Cease fire, climb and hold. Quickly now, boys, quickly.
At times, the men might fire in pairs, as they've been doing so far. At other times, certainly would be the case that they would wait and fire what is called the volley, all firing together, which could be tremendously effective.
Private, is your weapon clear? Weapons clear. Make ready. Take aim. Fire. Retire.
So just as quickly as they advance, the men will return back to another spot. Particularly for men like this carrying rifles, if they are getting too close to an opponent with muskets that could shoot far more quickly than they could, they certainly are going to retreat as quickly as they can and use the advantage of the extra range that their rifles provide. So muskets are accurate to about 100 yards in distance. The rifles, again, 200 to 300 yards. So very advantageous, but also can be kind of problematic in close quarters. Unfortunately, as is the case with most guns in the 18th century, they might misfire or have a variety of issues just as commonly as they will actually fire. That's part of the imperative of being in pairs, is that you can protect the other person, particularly if their gun is being reloaded or perhaps has a misfire and doesn't actually go off. The 18th century soldier's greatest weapon probably wasn't anything that he was actually carrying. In fact, it was his fleetness of foot and how quickly he could move around a battlefield. We often think about the Revolutionary War as stagnant conflicts fought in lines, but in fact, the ability to maneuver quickly and run around was tremendously important. So the men will now move off and find another position. So that should just give you a brief idea of some of what frontier fighting might be in this area of Virginia and further west into what's now Kentucky and Ohio. Most of these troops, again, are going to be proficient in training in what were called Indian tactics in the period. Basically a variety of things like moving in column, taking cover, that were adapted and learned from warfare with a variety of Eastern Indian tribes. But so at this time, very happy to take any questions or curiosities y'all might have about the Revolutionary War or frontier.
What is the role of African Americans and women in the Revolutionary War?
That's an excellent question. So we would really be remiss if we didn't discuss the role of marginalized peoples, particularly people of color and women on the frontier and in the Revolutionary War more broadly. The first thing to consider is that the Revolutionary War would not have been won without really people of color in general. When we speak about the British colonies, particularly the colony of Virginia, which is the colony that is producing a lot in the way of manpower, supplies, and really financial help for the Revolutionary War effort, all of that was really profiteered over 150 years of profiting off the backs of enslaved people in Virginia. If Virginia did not have this wealthy planters and plantation economy, they would not have had the money to fight the Revolutionary War, and that's just a fact. So that's something we really do need to acknowledge. More broadly, when speaking about the war effort in general, we know that around 5,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army in some form or fashion as soldiers. Beyond that, a variety would be serving in a variety of non-combat roles. At times, this was a completely integrated army in a way that we wouldn't see again until the 20th century. At other times, with units like the Rhode Island Regiment, which is fairly famous, it was actually at least a somewhat cohesive African-American unit. It is worth noting that even though they were fighting, most of the African Americans that were fighting in the Continental Army were not given positions of authority, unfortunately. Pretty commonly, they didn't get above the rank of corporal. So despite the fact that we allowed African Americans to help us and quite a few fought and died for the United States, they still were not treated as equals in the 18th century, and that's an unfortunate fact. The other thing to take note of is that the majority of those Africans were fighting in hopes of achieving their freedom. That was something being offered by the Continental Army and Congress, but more broadly, that was also being offered by the British Empire. And in fact, far more African slaves flocked to the British side in hopes of fighting for their freedom here in North America than ever did the Continental Army. Perhaps as many as 20,000 African slaves flocked to the British side, so significantly more than the American cause. Speaking more broadly of women, it's sort of a difficult thing to measure. Speaking in combat roles, we do know that there were women who served as soldiers. Often they did so in disguise. A very good example of this is Deborah Sampson, who fought as a soldier during the Revolutionary War and was only caught because she was shot, and through extracting the ball from her leg, the surgeon noticed that, hey, you're not a man. There are also a number of women who served outright in combat roles as a result of necessity. So the term you usually hear is Molly Pitcher, which in this time period meant someone who was bringing water to the troops. Some famous Molly Pitchers, including Margaret Corbin and Mary Ludwig Hayes, were women who were helping their husbands and bringing water to the troops, and their husbands either died or could no longer fight, and so they picked up usually the worm or the cannon rammer and helped to load cannons to continue the fighting. Beyond that, women are instrumental to an army on a march. We're a bunch of guys, especially when you talk about the Continental Army, a bunch of young 20-something guys who had never had to really cook for themselves. A lot of them didn't know how to do laundry, and certainly couldn't be repairing their uniforms when they broke down. So all of those roles were usually goals are being done by camp followers or people following the Army. That might be the wives of people enlisted, or it might just be women at large. Beyond that, nurses are tremendously important, and nurses would commonly be women that are following the troops as well. Now, speaking particularly about Crockett's Western Battalion, which is the force that we portray here at the museum, we frankly don't know what the impact was, or if there were people of color or women in the ranks. Thus far, that's sort of been something we haven't been able to find, but quite frankly, that might have been something that was just lost to history entirely, but we certainly are continuing to research that. We do know that there are women who were with Crockett's Western Battalion in a following capacity, and they followed them all the way out to what's now Louisville, or the Falls of the Ohio. So there were women that followed these men really into the tremendous wilderness and dangerousness of the frontier to help them in that role.
Misty wants to know, were there any loyalist battalions from the frontier?
So in general, there are loyalists. You could think of about 20 to 30% of all the population of colonial North America would have remained loyal to the British cause. So they did form a number of units that would have been a part of the British Army and the British establishment. It's not quite as prevalent to see loyalists here in the Valley of Virginia on this frontier. It seems that while there were a few, the fervor for patriotism was pretty high in this area, and the few loyalists that were here were unfortunately kind of pretty heavily abused and overshadowed by their more patriotic colleagues. So I don't know of any frontier units specifically from this area of Virginia, but there were loyalist units really throughout colonial North America. So thank you very much for joining us here. This kind of programming is something that is made possible by donations to the Frontier Culture Museum, which you might be able to make a donation to the American Frontier Culture Foundation in the link found below. But we are very thankful that you were able to come and watch us here and see what we're doing here at the Frontier Culture Museum. Have a great 4th of July.